So again, the point is that we're looking at a global economy. We no longer have these kind of sovereignty zones where the economy of this one sovereign nation state sort of dictates economic policy around the world. It doesn't work that way anymore. And the place where that really becomes sort of interesting is in the area of intellectual property, or IP. And there's probably no other area that's more contentious or more fluid than this sort of biopharma, genetic engineering, synthetic biology world, because the whole idea of owning a patent on a living thing is a very different territory, isn't it?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, if you go back in time, I think it probably was like, correct me if I'm wrong, mid-'90s or so, there was a judge who basically ruled that you could patent a living thing, which sent Monsanto and DuPont and all these other people scrambling down to the jungles of South America to start patenting a variety of plants and species.
Well, as a matter of fact, one of my sort of comrades from the past era was one of those people. He was actually in the Amazon. I've been to Brazil 4 times myself, actually. And he was actually collecting botanical specimens for precisely this purpose. They wanted to discover new kinds of potential pharmaceutical compounds that could be derived out of these various plants and that sort of thing. Actually, just for the sake of conversation, where the most lucrative or potentially interesting area is not in the jungles, but in the oceans. That's where you find the most interesting and diverse and really strange organisms that have completely strange metabolisms, but because of their strange metabolisms, you get these weird biomolecular systems that you can extract from them and use them for other purposes. So actually the most sort of biopharma research is in the harvesting of things out of the oceans.
Interesting. Really interesting. Okay, so
in fact, that's where Craig Ventnor is. I mean, he's, as you may know, he was the private version of the Human Genome Project. He had a company called Solera at the time. In fact, I met Craig Ventnor and also Francis Collin, who was the director of NIH's, the government's version of the Human Genome Project. And these guys were blood enemies. I mean, they really had a, kind of a brutal, knockdown, drag-out fight because, the government version was it's going to take $10 billion and, 20 years and all these big schools are going to get these huge grants and everything. And Craig Ventnor said, no, listen, I'm a private, venture capital sort of guy. We can do this for $500 million and do it in 3 years. And in a way, they were both sort of right and wrong. It was a good experiment because it showed the best answer really is when you have competition from both the public and private sectors, and they sort of do their own thing and then find out where the two meet. And that's really what happened. But I met the both of them at the Bio 2000 conference here in San Francisco, and it was quite an event because they had just cracked the genome. And I went to this private party. It was a kind of a celebration kind of deal. And this was the corporate bio IT world's biggest shindig. It was hot and beyond your wildest dreams. It was buckets of caviar and big ice statues and people in tuxes. And it was quite the thing. And I actually took home a plot of the entire human genome on this 8-foot-long poster. I still have it rolled up on my wall. But since that time, the world of determining what is proprietary and what is not, that's become a very strange territory.
Are you and I proprietary right now?
Well, yes and no. The one thing I often say when I get in these discussions is we may be the last of our kind in the sense that, let me try a thought meme and see if this works for you. As you probably know, in earlier times, by legal definition, there were so-called acts of God, quote unquote. That is, things that cannot be covered or sanctioned under the domain of law in terms of things that would occur in the natural world, storms, various diseases, earthquakes, natural phenomena, the weather, whatever you might want to call it, for the sake of risk analysis and insurance and that kind of thing. However, those boundary points determining what is act of God versus what's act of man has become ever fuzzier. And one area where that's really true is in living things. And as we step into the arena of genetic modification, what's called genopharmacopoeia, and the concept of looking at one's genome to try to determine what your fluids for various diseases and then developing potential remedies for that, even as they're being born, that kind of thing. We may be the last of the natural born human beings. We may be evolving into a world where it's going to be part syncoid and part humanoid. That's one way to look at it.
So we're on the horns of a dilemma as far as I can see it, Charles, because let's say, for instance, and you and I think we're going to get into, who drives what I would call the inherent morality around this.
Oh, yeah. I know this debate well. Sure, yeah.
But we're on the horns of a dilemma because the science is outpacing the judicial ability to rule on these things in a way, because judicial law comes out of an organic realm. You know.
Well, and that's once again, forgive me for interrupting, but to make a point really well known, the whole idea of sovereignty is where this really comes into play, because whose jurisdiction is it? Even if a court here, let's just say with the latest passing of the bills in Congress and Senate to do with health care reform, et cetera, whatever you want to call it, we're stepping into a territory now where the government's going to be saying, this is the insurance you need and you have to buy this insurance and blah, blah. Okay, fine. Well, as a condition to get that insurance, it may be required that you have to have a genomic workup to determine what your proclivity is, or preconditioned perhaps from a genetic perspective. And that may determine the cost of the health care and access to employment and access to credit and all kinds of things. And maybe not now, but certainly years ahead. And yet, which jurisdiction has control over this? If we're living in a global economy and people's lives or career choices, et cetera, are being driven by their genetic footprint, then they'll go elsewhere in the world where the genetic footprint has a different kind of judicial control. So it's really because of a very fluid domain indeed.
Well, okay. So let's. I mean, that you've just opened a whole can of worms there.
Gee, we're only 5 minutes into the show, but hey, that's okay.
Maybe I should have used a more synthetic analogy.
Fair enough.
You've opened a whole can of nanites.
Oh, yes, indeed.
So all right. So now we've got the health bill, which is a whole other discussion unto itself. Yeah. It's given a huge amount of power now to various bodies inside the health, inside the government, inside the private care industry.
Yeah, I have real mixed feelings about this. Yeah.
It's called the medical industry for a reason, right? I mean, so here now you've got this whole set of guidelines that are going to evolve out of this decision. And you and I both know that whenever they bake this stuff, there's maybe about 70% of it that is black and white.
Yeah.
And there's another 30% that's kind of gray.
I would say it's more like 50-50 gray and black and white.
Yeah,
it's a moving boundary point. I'll put it that way.
I was being hopeful, Charles. I was being optimistic, okay?
Okay, fair enough.
So 50-50. Now that gray area is there. Now what happens in that gray area is really, in a lot of ways, going to be determined not by our representatives, but by market forces. Am I right?
You're partially right. And market forces is itself kind of an odd domain. Let me see if I can throw a few data points in here to kind of give it more complexity, as it were. Because it's not just free market domain, like who's going to buy what healthcare. That's kind of irrelevant. What it really matters is, what does the economic engine of the future have to rely upon to make its viability contiguous over some length of time? We all know that the number 2 driver for bankruptcy in today's world is the cost of healthcare. People are going bankrupt or losing their houses because they got charged some gigantic hospital bill because they couldn't get insurance coverage. I mean, there clearly was a reason for doing this. However, as we shift into this sort of new world, employers, the ability to make an income from a range of small to large businesses who are now going to have to take on a very different kind of roadmap to have compliancy, to not only be able to hire people, but to insure them and make sure they agree to all the appropriate compliancy codes. And then even the IRS now is going to be an enforcement agent to sort of make sure the compliancy is obeyed. This puts a very different kind of template on how these things are done. So people's career choices, even their educational paths, may be affected by what this emerging sort of health maintenance process of the system. And that's something to be considered, because that directly affects the economy.
Charles, aren't we treading dangerously, though, to kind of a soft eugenics? I mean, let's look at it from an employer's perspective.
Sure.
So let's say we go down this path, and part of all of this is the genomic makeup. Yeah. Right? Sure. And let's say the genomic makeup covers the fact that I might be open to having a heart attack before the age of 55.
Exactly right.
And now my employer or potential employer says to me, sorry, we have a long-term investment in you.
Right.
And now you're a potential risk for us in terms of investment.
This type of genomic mapping is exactly what I was talking about, and you got it right square center of target. And that could cover things like behavior patterns. It could cover things like proclivity for certain mental disorders or proclivity for addictive personality. I mean, these are all things that have genetic markers. These are already been sort of codified. So how far does one play this template out? And if companies are now sort of extending themselves into this new territory where sort of long-term risk analysis as part of the first stage in putting people into their sort of high-end career paths, this is exactly the kind of map that will probably be part of that process. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I'm old school, and I tend to think that humans have an immense amount of capacity to overcome trial and tribulation in their lives, be it physical or emotional, and to be sort of singled out and say, well, I'm sorry, we can't invest you long term, unless of course you go see our friends, over on the other side of town. In which case, they'll be happy to put a nano-driven regulator inside your heart.
Yeah. No, I see where you're going with this. I'll give you kind of the short version of this. One thing that I do see, probably not too distant future, is when a baby is being born, when the baby's still in the womb, and a genetic makeup's already being worked up, before the baby comes out of the womb, the parents will be told, well, here's the map, here's the proclivity for these different diseases or different potential pathologies. I mean, this is sort of done now, but not with genetics. I mean, everybody knows that if you have certain characteristics in your family line, be it male or female side, dominant versus recessive genes, they can kind of give a probability factor as to what your proclivity might be. And then once they refine this process to actual genetic mapping, you can be much more precise kind of way of doing this. So, I mean, at a certain point, this might become a requirement, to get your Social Security card, to get your other kinds of registration to fit into the larger scheme of things. It's going to be a requirement to have a certain genetic mapping. I'll give you kind of a strange example. As I was saying to you off the air, some friends of mine who used to live in my house, I rent part of my house out to visiting faculty, they actually gave birth to a baby in my house, which I thought was pretty cool, and they had midwives come over and everything. But part of their deal was they didn't want to have to go through the hospital / registration of all these different things. They wanted to keep their kid off the grid, as it were. And that's kind of a movement that's going on. There is a real, actual conscious effort among some to sort of stay off this grid, as it were, as much as possible, for however long that may be possible, and to what extent that becomes kind of irrelevant. That's hard to say. But it is a kind of an awareness people currently have. Now, the flip side of this coin is as follows. I mean, there are a lot of genetic diseases which are truly horrible. I mean, truly horrible. Lou Gehrig's disease, spinal bifida, the whole variety of neurological disorders. I mean, some things which are just truly hideous. And if one does have the capacity to recognize the potential for this as a baby's being born and then correct for it, that's a good thing. I mean, there is a positive side to this. But
I agree. For the most part, I am more along the organic, carbonic, biological, evolutionary lines. But I also understand that there can be an interface at a very, very beneficent level between the type of technology that you're talking about and some of the really horrible disorders. And ALS, certainly you touch on them as one of them.
Yeah, ALS is a really horrible disease. So is MS. I mean, there's several diseases which are truly hideous, and if they can be corrected, I'm all for it.
And I have a personal relationship to ALS because my ex-wife's mother passed away from ALS, and yet
my condolences. Yeah.
The amount of research and money that's devoted to ALS is dwarfed by cancer, and I don't even want to get into my relationship with cancer. My father just passed away from that recently, and it was a three-ring circus when it came to dealing with him.
Yeah, I understand.
I guess for me, Charles, and I just keep coming back to for me, the organizing principle around all of this is who is driving the morality. What is the baseline? And here's the second part of that question for you.
Please. Yeah.
If there is what we would call a convergence, which is this ability to have technology and organic structures move more on a closer simultaneous track, there also is possibly a divergence, which is people that were in your house that gave birth to a kid that wanted to be outside of the matrix.
Exactly.
So my question to you is twofold. One is what is the organizing principle that's driving the morality? And two, where do you see the convergence and divergence meeting and then moving apart?
And we only have an hour and a half. Okay, just kidding. But those are like what's the meaning of life kind of questions. But I'll do this as best I can in a small way. Couple of things.